So I want to thank everyone for a terrific set of breakout discussions. I was fortunate enough to be able to visit with each one of them at various times, and I learned something at each one. We had good turnout, good discussions. We hope you found them useful. People seem to be coming back talking engaged. That is the idea. And I know we spent the last hour and a half or so delving into power maps, judicial selection commissions. I heard reference to public financing of city council races, and even a writ of mandamus. So our last plenary of the day is to get to everybody's political junkie bones and talk politics. And specifically, we're going to talk about the political landscape right now, what's going on generally, but also in particular its impact on state courts and what's going on. And we're honored to have us leading us in this session, Marilyn Carpintero. Yes. Woo. Well said. And she is with Common Cause, another whoop there, because Common Cause has been one of our early best friends from when we started in this. They get these issues. They've been all over them for a long time. We appreciate their help. And she is their Director of State Operations. She joined Common Cause, I think, 4 years ago, and she works with their groups around the country, in particular on core democracy programs that we're focused on here, so voting in elections, corporate accountability, money in politics, and fair courts. And she's based in DC, but I know spends a lot of time around the country. Before this, she cut her teeth as the legislative political director at New Jersey Citizen Action, where nothing was going on, I'm sure. And she worked a lot on 2 of their clean election pilot programs. So we couldn't have a better person to take us through this final plenary discussion. Marilyn, take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, everyone, for sticking with us throughout this long day. I know there's been a lot of great discussions going on, and we hope that we can continue that dialogue moving forward. But before we start, I do want to thank Justice at Stake for hosting the summit. I think it really is a testament to the growing movement for fair and impartial courts, and really everyone here in this room is at the core of it. So I want to hats off to everyone, and I think the next 2 days will be a little more enlightening, and hopefully, we can leave here on Wednesday really renewed, refreshed, and recommitted to the work that we all have back in our states. So thank you for that. So the focus of this discussion is really to talk about the political landscape, and we have had, throughout the day, we've heard tidbits of what has been going on and that's been trickling down to states. And so we have 3 individuals with us today who are going to help us jump into this and explore these trends a little bit more. Then we will also ask you all to participate by submitting some questions. If you'll look on your table, there are index cards. You can please, throughout the discussion here, submit them, and I believe there will be somebody collecting them and passing them around. So with me on the dais, we have Anna Greenberg, Senior Vice President for Greenberg Quinlan Rosner Research. Next to her, we have Brian Nienaber from the Terrence Group, Vice President there. And then we have Greg Moore, the Senior Strategist for the Democracy Initiative. And so it goes without saying today that the state courts play a critical role in our democratic process. But what also is apparent is that we shouldn't be surprised that the courts are also not immune to what's happening politically, electorally, or to the Supreme Court. So with that, I want us to be in this frame of mind of why do we want to talk about the political landscape? Because at the end of the day, it does impact it, specifically right now in a time period where the electorate, elected officials, and state legislatures are becoming more and more polarized. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Anna.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? I just want you to know that this is a really hard couch for me to sit on. So if I look weird as I can't, it's not made for short people. Okay. So thanks for having me. This is a really, really important issue, and it's one of these, I want to call it a sleeper issue, but it's one that couldn't be more important from the Supreme Court down to state courts. If you think about Citizens United to reproductive rights to you name it, courts are central to everything that happens in our democracy, but they tend not to be top of mind issues for voters. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just really appreciate being able to come here and speak with you and also some of the work that we've done over the years with Justice at Stake. So my charge is to talk about sort of the trends and where things are going this election cycle, and then reflect a little bit about judicial reform and elections as well, though I have less to say about that than the overall trends. First of all, as you all know, this country is changing, and it's changing really rapidly. And so it's a country that is increasingly diverse. Certainly the rise of the Hispanic population is critical to that, but also the Asian American population. So we have, a country that's increasingly, going to be by 2050 minority country, and that obviously has a huge impact on how things will look politically, not just now, but look in the future. I think that there has been a lot of speculation about when certain states are going to turn blue, like Texas, for example, and other places, or say purple anyway before it turns blue, I guess. And when things are going to happen in different states around, say, congressional districts and redistricting as the population changes and be able to produce more competitive seats. None of that seems to have, not none of it, but a lot of it has not really come to fruition yet. So I think we need to be a little modest about thinking about the role of these changes. They happen, but they happen slowly over time. They're significant. One of the reasons why Republican pollsters at the presidential level in 2012 got a lot of those numbers wrong was that I think they misunderstood what the nature of the electorate was going to look like. They had an assumption around going back to, say, a 2004 electorate, which is a lot wider than what the 2012 electorate looked like. At the same time, the changes are a percentage point every presidential cycle. It's not 5 or even 10-point shifts. It's 1 point. So the changes are slow over time. And obviously what complicates that in a midterm election like 2014 is that we have voters who vote in presidential elections who don't vote in midterm elections. We call those drop-off voters. And drop-off voters tend to be more democratic. They tend to be younger, they tend to be minority, tend to be urban. And so some of the places that are competitive, for example, in presidential years, end up being less competitive in midterm elections. And so what we will see for sure is a more Republican electorate in 2014 than compared to 2012. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about what this electorate will look like, and looking, where is the enthusiasm? Is there more Democratic enthusiasm, more Republican enthusiasm? Is it a wave election? And what I'd say is that right now, in my view, and I'll be interested to hear what others had to say on the panel, is it doesn't look like a wave election. It looks more like a status quo election than anything else. It certainly does not look like 2006, which was a significant Democratic wave election, where you had a significant gap in enthusiasm between Democratic voters and Republican voters, and Democrats won independent voters by 22 points. And it doesn't look like 2010 election either, where you had much more enthusiasm on the Republican side, and Republicans won independent voters by 20 points. It looks like something closer to, certainly something in between 2010 and 2012, where there is a little more enthusiasm for Republican voters, and you see that in a bunch of national polls, including, I think Pew came out with a poll yesterday that showed there's somewhat more Republican enthusiasm. And that obviously matters for what the electorate looks like. And why? I mean, it has to do with a lot of different things, but part of it is there is some diminishment of optimism and enthusiasm among Democratic voters that you've seen over time since 2010, but especially with the rollout, for example, of the ACA website, the continuing troubles of the economy, the continuing international troubles. There's just more, I would say, kind of confusion and depression among Democratic voters, and we don't have that same kind of Tea Party right-wing base that is incredibly enthusiastic about their primaries and their general election. So I don't believe that small enthusiasm gap makes for a wave election, but it's certainly there. But I would argue if we look at the races that really matter, it's a pretty competitive environment. So if we look, for example, now I say it's competitive, but small changes can actually create huge changes. So for example, Republicans could win the Senate and it wouldn't require that many votes to do it, but it could create obviously huge political change. So saying we're in a competitive environment doesn't mean that you can't have huge change coming out of this election. So right now, there's lots of speculation about what will happen with the Senate, and I believe there have been a bunch of analyses or predictions that have come out in the last week or so that suggest that Republicans have an edge on keeping the Senate. I believe that I'd say it's a 50-50 chance. I like our chances of keeping the Senate. Where the Senate control is going to rest are in a number of races. There are some races where you've had Democratic retirements in states that are heavily Republican, like Montana and South Dakota, where it seems unlikely that Democrats keep those seats. But the actions in Louisiana, North Carolina, Alaska, and Arkansas, I don't know if anybody lives in any of those states, but you've been seeing ads for a long time. And then there's other states that seem to be competitive that we might not have thought would be competitive. So for instance, Iowa is looking very competitive, but so is Georgia and potentially Kentucky. So in order for Republicans to take back the Senate, they basically have to sweep these 4. But there's a possibility, certainly, that Democrats pick up, for example, Georgia is looking very positive. So it's very competitive. Republicans have to do a lot. It's certainly possible to take back the Senate. And we'll see where, on the other hand, when people talked about Michigan and Colorado as potentially competitive Republican pickups, it seems like those are going in the other direction. So it's all very, I think, it's all very dynamic. At the gubernatorial level, and really, I mean, it's not that the Senate matters for you, because the Senate matters a lot in terms of, for example, Supreme Court appointments. But certainly for those of you doing your work at the state level, it's really the gubernatorial and legislative elections that matter a lot for you. And if we look at what's happening at the gubernatorial level, there certainly are some chances for net Democratic pickup of state houses. Right now, the places that look most likely are Pennsylvania and Maine for Democratic pickups. But Florida's looking competitive as well, and even Wisconsin, which had been looking pretty strong for Walker, in light of some of the more recent revelations around corruption and other issues, that race appears to be closing. Other races like Michigan and Ohio seem tougher for Democratic pickups, but it actually looks like a place where there might be net Democratic gains. And then if we look at the state legislative level, I mean, one of the things that I know that that Justice Stake is focused on is how kind of single-party rule, or what I sometimes call trifecta states, where you control both the governor and both houses, has an impact on judicial reform, certainly in judicial elections. If we look, I don't see that there's going to be a lot of change at the legislative level. There are actually only 4 states that have split, where you have a Democratic or Republican governor and a Democratic Republican legislature, where you don't have the same. It's Iowa, Kentucky, New Hampshire, and West Virginia. And there are some legislatures that are close, where you might see a switch. For example, the Arizona State Senate. It's not clear there's going to be a very strong Republican gubernatorial candidate in the Arizona gubernatorial race. The Arkansas House, the Iowa Senate, the New Hampshire Senate is a total possibility for Democrats to pick up, with a very strong top of the ticket. Maybe even the Wisconsin Senate. So there's probably some, and certainly on the Democratic side, Labor and others have put a very high priority on legislative races. So there may well be some pickup of different state houses and legislatures around the country. But overall, if you think about the number of states that have single-party rule and have mixed, I don't see that changing dramatically coming out of this election. It will be somewhat at the margins. So what are the sort of themes that I think will inform this election? This election's been going on for a long time, so I think we know, but certainly the economy is the kind of the overlay. For Republicans, it's obviously a critique of kind of Democratic stewardship of the economy. And while certainly we know there are macroeconomic indicators that suggest that things are getting better, whether it's the stock market or unemployment rate, housing, it's also the case that lots of people, probably the majority of people, still feel pretty bad about how they're doing financially. They feel like they came out of the recession, they held on, or they've gotten a new job, but they don't feel like they're going to do better. Right? The new normal is to sort of get by month to month, or to have a job that wasn't as good as the job before the recession. And they see a lot of people at the top doing significantly better, but it sort of feels like treading water, getting by month to month is going to be the way things are from now on. And that's not helpful, obviously, for Democrats, even as there are certain aspects of the economy that are getting stronger and stronger. And I would also argue that it's been challenging to understand exactly what the economic message is coming out of the Democratic side. But that's the overarching. Obviously, on the Democratic side, you can make you can see, and there will be lots of arguments made about things like minimum wage and women's economic standing, and a whole range of kind of economic policies at the federal and state level that Republicans promulgate that actually hurt the middle class, hurt working people. And so even in the light of an economy that has been sort of overseen by a Democratic president, that whether it's blocking jobs bills in the House or various things at the state level, there's a very strong narrative as well about who they're for, where Republicans would take this economy. More specifically, and again, if you're in any of the states that are competitive at the Senate level, you're already seeing lots of advertising on this. But on the Republican side, you're continuing to see ongoing advertising about Obamacare. I believe that issue is going to be less and less. You already see evidence that it's less and less powerful. It wasn't even that powerful, frankly, in previous elections. Certainly in 2012, it wasn't all that powerful. But you still see, advertising on that, particularly focused on cuts to Medicare, accusing Democrats of cutting $700 billion from Medicare. More specifically, you're starting to see ads on cap and trade. In some places, I think you may well see stuff on immigration. I think a lot of that depends on where you are. But a lot of the, there are a bunch of competitive places on the border, certainly on the congressional level, but it actually doesn't really even matter, because these immigration issues play out, at least rhetorically and ideologically, even if you're someplace where you don't have an issue with immigration per se. And so that's going to depend obviously on how things evolve, and it's an evolving situation, but I wouldn't be surprised. On the Democratic side, you see a couple things, and this is, I think, most relevant to the issue of judicial reform. There's a very, very strong push to talk about money in politics, and it's being portrayed primarily in terms of the Kochs. And so I think there are ads right now in Iowa and North Carolina and even Louisiana that invoke the Koch brothers. And they just don't, and they don't just invoke the money. They don't just say, oh, they're these out-of-state billionaires coming and spending. They talk about the policies, and in particular focused on cuts or elimination of, for example, turning Medicare into a voucher program, but also tax policy and opposing, say, tax cuts for the middle class. And again, you're seeing those ads right now on TV if you're in those states. Also some focus on Medicare, and particularly how the Ryan budget treats Medicare, and talking about Medicare turning into a voucher program. You're going to see those two areas. You're seeing, and you're going to see a lot of advertising. And where I think this is relevant to the issue of judicial reform, which, as you can imagine, I'm sure you're under no illusions, not the #1 issue on the top of people's minds, even though, again, we know that issues that get decided in courts at the state and federal level have a huge impact on people's lives. People tend to not know very much about them in general. They certainly don't know very much about the people who are on the ballot. But what we do know is that people really don't like the infusion of money into judicial elections. They don't like the idea of the politicization and partisan nature of judicial elections. What people value, or what they believe they value in courts, are courts that can be fair, which is to say impartial, right, and transparent and accountable. And so one of the major thrusts, certainly I would think, as folks are getting involved in these races, in particular in advocating for judicial reform and reform of elections, is focusing on the issue of money. And really, the money, I mean, I've been doing work on financial services reform and regulation, and some work on this and other places, and it really is amazing how the Citizen United decision, first of all, has increased. I mean, people have always sort of been against money in politics in principle, but you have a very hard time getting support for, say, public financing, or even I've done research on the checkoff box on taxes and how hard it is to get people to check off the box. But the Citizen United decision really has changed the landscape, and there is a focus on that kind of tie between politicians and money and policy, outcomes and consequences. And I believe that those ties are deeply relevant for judicial elections and could be made relevant in the work that you're doing. So even though the Koch brothers issue is sort of federal and state, I see it trickling down to the places where you're active. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to my Republican counterpart.
And building on money in our elections, I want to turn it over to Brian.
Okay, good. I think, I don't want to retell a lot of the soil that Anna did, because I think we're of somewhat like mind about how this is going to go. I just want to emphasize a couple points, and one is, in the Senate, a lot of these elections make a big, big difference. The ideological difference between a lot of these Senate candidates is really vast. It's a big difference whether Mitch McConnell comes back or Allison London Grimes takes his place, or whether Cory Gardner wins or Udall wins, or whether, so that does make a big, big difference. And it makes a big difference in the House that a lot of the issues in the House is if say Republicans only pick up 4 or 5 seats, a lot of the problems that Boehner has is he has this sort of implacable caucus, and there's always 4 or 5 guys who don't want to go along with anything. Well, if he's got 4 or 5 more votes to do things, that makes a big, big difference. So I would just say, I think that the realm of competitive seats will be different, but it's also, this is really an election where, in a stunning number of states, I think there's a really stark contrast between the two candidates, where you're making a real decision about their sort of ideological differences. And I think we're in a position with the House where even a pickup of a handful of seats really sort of changes the way in which they're able to go out and do things. I will tell you, I think in terms of looking ahead, you've kind of caught me at a bad time. We're in a bit of a lull. We do a bipartisan poll, unfortunately with one of Anna's competitors, so I won't name who they are, but.
I know who it is.
Okay. They're all much better colleagues than we are, I think, on our side. But we're looking to have one in August. I'll have much better answers for you in a few weeks. But we're kind of in a lull between the two of them. But I think, this really will be. I think we'll certainly try and run the traditional 6-year presidential election where, you assume voters are somewhat dissatisfied because they're now 6 years in and they've either not gotten what they wanted, or they're so angry because they think the president has gotten everything he wanted, and you're sort of, as the out party, you're able to run as not the president, not the party that's been in power, and sort of tap into that resentment. And certain things we've seen, there is some frustration and resentment, but I will tell you the other thing I've been struck by is, both parties now have a pretty polarized side that we've faced a fair number of problems with primaries. We had Thad Cochran in Mississippi. We have other states that it was less public, but where we're really, the candidate or the incumbent faced a pretty sizable challenge on the right from people who had, relatively minor differences, but were very frustrated with the system. And I'd be interested to sort of see, do those people stay in that sort of box, or they now sort of have their frustration out at the ballot box, or, how will that be different? And I would just, emphasize a couple other points on the Koch brothers. And I fondly remember in '06 when we were looking down the barrel of a wave election and ended up losing quite a few seats on both the House and the Senate, we tried to sort of make Nancy Pelosi into the boogeyman. And the problem was just not enough voters knew who she was. And so you'd be out saying this person's just going to be a rubber stamp for Nancy Pelosi and don't vote for them. And she's the San Francisco liberal and you should be very fearful of the type of policy she'll bring to your wholesome district. And just too many people didn't know who she was, and we couldn't do it. And we, a few months ago completed a national study, bipartisan study, and we had both Harry Reid and the Koch brothers, and this was sort of at the very beginning of where Harry Reid was going down to the Senate floor every day and demonizing the Koch brothers and saying that they're everything that's wrong with our American political system. And these were, we polled likely 2014 voters, so people who have cleared the screen and told us I'm likely to vote in the elections. And more than a third of them both had no idea who Harry Reid was, did not have an image of Harry Reid, and had no idea who the Koch brothers were. So it's really, for a lot of these people, this was just two people who they had no idea who they were, sort of trading charges with each other. And it was obviously much higher for the Koch brothers if people didn't know who they were. And, I think you're just always in dangerous ground doing that. But I would tell you, I think that the plus I can tell you on judicial reform and reform of the judicial system is, I think Ian right. People do like the idea of having a judiciary that's sort of apart from the other two. And this really is, I think, an extraordinary development. I mean, it's only been in the last 5-10 years. It used to be, if you got a state court hearing you didn't like, that was kind of the end of the road for you. It's tough break, and let's go out and try and figure out something else. It really, within the last few years, has been unheard of. Say, well, we got a state Supreme Court reading we didn't like. Let's target this justice and that one for elections, and we'll, get some more judges who are friendly to whatever our point of view is on this issue. And turning these races, I know I'm from Ohio. We had a big Supreme Court races there over some issues. Other states that we've worked in, Iowa, other places where these races that used to be judges would run unopposed, even at the state Supreme Court level, where you now have these high dollar, expensive races. And I think, I think the good thing from your perspective is these are people, even likely voters, are just not used to participating in these elections. They don't really, I think, have a solid understanding on too many times of what's going on. And so one of the big findings we found when we've done into it is people, if you can be first to the post and say, here's why merit selection seems better. Here's why, a system where these judges aren't out soliciting money from the same people that they're having cases in front of them, or a system where we have panels or other things, that sounds better than going into the voting booth and picking one of these two judges where you really don't understand a lot about either of them, really makes a huge difference. And that for a lot of these voters, that's the first time they thought about that. It's the first piece of information they've gotten. And you really can't get to them and sort of make them on your side for life of, hey, this is the way this ought to be. They think that it really is a strong opportunity, and certainly the stuff we've done on it, when you look at the messaging, it's relatively simple, easily replicatable of the merits of having judges that are sort of above the fray, and having a system where they're selected by their merits, and having a system where they stand maybe for retention, but not necessarily in some sort of competitive system, really makes a huge difference in having people think that this is a much better system than having it sort of be politicized, along with electing their state legislative leaders, electing their state constitutional officials. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Greg.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of the panel. This is when I regret not going to law school, I guess. But I want to make a few points about the political landscape and then make a couple points about some of the reforms that you spoke of. First, on a political, scene, I think Anna laid it out. One of the remarkable things about this race, I think, is the impact that the changing demographics are going to have on some of these races. You mentioned Arkansas, North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia. These are states where there's heavy African-American presence, and so the turnout of African-American voters could really matter. Same is the case in states like Colorado and Florida, where the Latino vote and Hispanic vote will definitely make a big difference. So that's important to know that in these off-year elections, and we've had high water marks both in 2008 and 2012, but even if you go back to 2004, there were high water marks, and certainly we had a high water mark in Florida in 2000 that we all remember. But these turnout elections and off-year elections are really driving the dynamics of what the landscape looks like. And because there was such a high turnout, as you guys know how waves go, they come back down and they produce a much lower level of participation. And I guess the first thing to just realize is that the purpose of sort of these elections is to sort of get the notice out about the importance of not just the congressional races or the governor's races, but some of the lower level races as well, which ends up being, unfortunately, some of the judicial races where people have to make decisions. I think one of the points that I wanted to stress was that the change in demographics will make a difference in terms of maybe some of the partisanship. I mean, the partisanship right now seems to be, whether it was health care or immigration, those hot button issues that are driving most of the ads that you'll see. They're driving a lot of the commentary. They're driving a lot of the conversation on cable television. But it's driving down, I think, some of the participation, particularly if those issues do not directly impact some of those constituencies. The increasing partisanship also could impact this level of drop-off. So if there is a high interest in, for instance, the issue of voting rights, and voting rights has never gotten a vote on the floor of the Senate or the House, then that tends to drive voters away from saying, well, I would vote for this in this election if it looked like there was an issue that was important to me. In some of these states where Medicaid expansion has been stopped by the governors, sometimes the issue of the Affordable Care Act may not be as important in terms of a benefit if you are still waiting for your governor or your state to actually implement it. And so when you have a situation where you had a very popular president who's no longer now a visible force on that battlefield, and he probably won't be going into North Carolina, won't be going into Georgia, won't be going into Arkansas anytime soon, the other issues that are important in that election will have to be the driver for those turnouts. I think you mentioned the Cochran race, which was very interesting to me because I know for the first time I saw the impact of African-American voters on a Republican primary rather than just a Democratic primary. But I think it demonstrated the importance of certain demographics and the role they play in both parties and the ability to actually look at the situation, and I think that's what African-American voters did in Georgia and Mississippi, looked at the situation, saw that there's a possibility of a person adverse to their interests who could either be elected in November or could be elected in a runoff, and many of them chose to get engaged to nip it in the bud and not wait for a big turnout election in November. And I think you may see that trend happen again in open primary states where there might be opportunities for crossover voting in primaries where African-American voters or Latino voters may see their interests threatened and decide that the place to take that action may be more in the primary elections than in the general election. So the other few points, and I think you're such a smart crowd, I'd rather save some of this for the conversation that we're going to have for the Q&A, but 3 points on this reform issue. One is that courts are playing an increasingly important role in some of those wedge issues I talked about, voting rights, marriage equality, immigration. So anymore, most of the major issues that are not being able to be resolved by the Congress, because we're in the do-nothing Congress situation, they're really looking to the courts to play that role, and it's important for us to draw the importance of looking at the courts as the arbitrator of these kind of major hot-button issues. Second, voter participation in judicial elections can be impacted by issues, but also by placement on the ballot. I'm also a voter, had voted in Ohio, and I've seen sometimes to get to the Supreme Court or appellate court, you got to be on page 9 or page 10 of your ballot. And by that time, you've kind of been in line for 2 hours. You may not want to stick around to do all of that. And God knows if you're in California, you may be on page 29 before you get to the judges. So bringing that up to a level where people see it as an important part of civic engagement is important. And I think we need to develop some models for how we do a better job of that. Linkages between some of our big legal issues and voting is also important. For instance, there is, and Diane Russ Tierney and Joe Taker was on stage today talking about some of the important issues that really matter. But criminal justice reform or criminal justice issues are very impactful for certain communities, so that if people in your family or people in your community are impacted by, a judge, whether it's because of the high crime in your community or the high level of incarceration, then how people look at a judge and the role that a judge plays is very important. And so I'm raising that as only one example. The other example I thought about was the Trayvon Martin case, where people see the judicial system as a place where big social decisions are being decided in a courtroom. And so they may think that the courtroom deserves a lot more of my attention, or maybe as much of my attention around voting as the member of Congress or who's going to be the governor. The other example I thought of was the Brown versus Board of Education, going back over 50 years. That here's a case that was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, but it took a number of court challenges throughout the country to really resolve that issue, both at the local level and at the state level, and even some counties where there were desegregation cases that went on for years. So people are looking at that, particularly in my community, as a way that the courts are playing a major role even after big decisions are made. And finally, I think on this issue of voting rights in general and how best to increase the level of engagement of groups into this judicial reform, whether it's public financing or whether it's merit selection, these are still areas that require a little bit more public education, because I think there are things that will resonate with certain communities, particularly in the growing demographic, but it really does require some substantial resources being put toward education to broaden out this coalition, so that there's a sense that there's a way this can be linked with voting rights. There's a sense that this can be linked with criminal justice reform. It could be linked with education equity. These are the big issues that are driving many of our communities, and linking those issues closer to the judicial nominations and the retention races, I think, would be a good way to broaden out the coalition for more greater and broad-based reforms.
Thank you. So before we continue, I want to remind folks that there are index cards at your table, and if you have a question, please raise your card and somebody will come by to pick them up. So I want to start first by something that an entity that was brought up a couple of times, actually, the Koch brothers, and they have been growing in more prominence in our elections. But I guess my question is, are there other players now that are going to be increasing? Do you see that as will it end, will it continue, both at the federal level and then perhaps down to the state level?
Well, I mean, I think another entity that's very relevant to people in this room is ALEC, and ALEC is not completely different from the Kochs, because obviously some of the money comes from them, but ALEC has a huge impact on policy, and it's a perfect example of kind of the unhealthy/corrupt relationship between kind of corporate and moneyed interests and politicians and policy outcomes. And I think there's going to be certain states where bringing ALEC into this could be, at least on the Democratic side, it will be part of what reinforces the larger argument about the Kochs. That's possible.
Yeah, I think, with Citizens United and other rulings, it's really become much easier for even just one person who decides, I'd really like to have a bigger voice in this process, and I have an issue that I'm very concerned about, to get involved in the process and to set up something where they can really broadcast that in a very big way. So I would expect you'll see more, not less, that there's, a variety of titans and business interests who are going to want to make their voices heard, and that's, our current political and judicial process allows for.
Well, I saw in the book in the back, on the background material, that 98% of some of the money that went into North Carolina was from the conservative side, or the side that was opposing some of the judges. So if that's the case, my guess is that at some point the other side's going to get a clue and decide maybe they should put some money in also, or at least elevate it. I don't know if that's what you guys may want to happen, but it certainly seems like one of the things that at some point has to balance out.
Just staying on this topic of money, it's like, we got a question from, if you can please expand on the role of independent spending and super PACs in this cycle.
In what sense? It's going to be massive? Is that what you're, it's already massive? I think I saw somewhere that the amount of ads that have been on this cycle so far is already more than 2012.
Jeez.
And it's mostly, there's some campaign spending at the statewide level, but it's primarily independent expenditures.
Right. I think you'll see, but there's also an issue of, there's a diminishing return. When there's so many ads on the air and so many things, there really is a diminishing return on it. And at least, the people I've talked to that have done stuff with it are like, they'd much rather look into, is there a better way to do analytics, or is there a better way we could do grassroots? Because there's the idea of, well, I'm angry and I'm going to chip in $1 million. I'm going to buy these nasty TV spots, and this person's going to lose. Just hasn't, it's just, I think, become increasingly less effective when there's 12 other people doing the same thing on both sides.
Yeah, I think more money doesn't necessarily mean more influence. If you look at the spending last cycle, for example, for Republican-aligned super PACs versus Democratic-aligned super PACs, there's pretty clear evidence that the Republican-aligned did a much worse job of buying television than the Democratic side, which means they spent more money, it was less efficient. There were a lot of places where, a group would go up with an ad on one topic and come down, and there'd be a new topic, and it wasn't sort of, the narrative wasn't consistent. So more money doesn't necessarily mean more effective. You actually have to spend that money well. You have to figure out how to do it. You can't coordinate with campaigns, but you also have to constantly consider what the campaigns are doing so that the IE money, is either filling in a hole or reinforcing or taking on a piece of the task that the campaign can't do. So again, more money isn't necessarily better, but there is going to be more money this cycle than there was last cycle.
Yeah, I think Eric Cantor would agree with you about that.
What's interesting, you rate Eric Cantor. I actually got two questions about that. Like, why did he lose, and I'm sure that and how it impacts this cycle.
I'll let the Republican answer why he lost.
Well,
I like everyone, I was surprised.
I was surprised too. He's not a client, but I know his pollster, and we'd certainly not heard. I'd not heard through the grapevine that he was in any trouble. I think it was, in large part, when you're an incumbent and people don't hear from you, they now assume the worst. And I think he didn't do as good enough job keeping in touch with his district. And I think they sort of very unwisely turned his opponent into somebody. There's a lot of people who are angry with the incumbent, and they go vote for not you. And it doesn't matter what the name is, I'm voting for not Eric Cantor. And as long as there's a name there, they're hitting it. And so when he went up with these ads, I think one of which was a little misleading about his opponent's positions, now you've turned this person into not just an angry protest vote, but someone you clearly view as a viable alternative. And I think in the other issues, there was a low turnout. It was not an election that was expected to be competitive. And so if you get the mix of people who are very upset with you, who are going to show up to vote for not you, and you're not doing a good enough job turning out your supporters, you end up where you ended up. And these things happen every once in a while, and it happened this time.
Well, I think it's a little more systematic than that, in that what people talked about the most after the election was the immigration issue, but Bratt, if I'm saying his name correctly, talked a lot about he was a real populist and talked a lot about corporate welfare and talked a lot about Cantor's relationship with Wall Street, and I do think that he was seen as an elite, and I think that really hurt him the Tea Party is very conservative, it's also pretty populist, And I think that that really hurt Cantor with these base Republican voters. It's not a hobnobby Republican primary electorate.
Yeah, I think they did, this is one of the lessons on redistricting. They redistricted Cantor's district, and they thought they made it much safer. We added this huge stash of, rural voters from the exurban part of Richmond suburbs. And so you think, well, these are reliable Republican voters. They're just going to come punch the ticket for Cantor every year. Well, these people had never heard from him. They'd just been added to his district, with the 2010 redistricting. And so now here he is, and they've never heard from him, and he's not coming back. I think it was just a kind of perfect storm for seeing somebody who should have cruised to re-election getting beaten.
So, we have another question here, going back to money in politics and the experience that folks running a campaign against money in politics, i.e. Koch brothers, is really red meat for activists and well-informed voters, but it really doesn't help. It doesn't really help with low-informed voters. So is there proof that this is now effective as a broader message?
So I guess I would disagree. I agree that if you ask about the Koch brothers and you get pretty low levels of name identification, but it has been growing over time. We actually put it on every single poll we do just to see, right? And it's been growing over time. And I think it's true that you can't just attack the Kochs as kind of a generic set of billionaires who are coming in and trying to influence you have to connect it to their policies, right? And so so that's why if you look at the ads that are on TV right now, you'll see it talks about Social Security and Medicare. It talks about middle-class taxes. It doesn't just say, oh, there are these big bad people coming in. It actually talks about what their priorities are. If you don't make that connection, then you're right. For low information voters, they just think, oh, it's just another bunch of rich people spending money in elections.
Yeah, I just think, I appreciate that tactic. I just think that's a long way around for most voters. That the Koch brothers are not, they run a reasonable business in the Midwest. Neither one of them hardly ever says anything publicly. They donate a lot of money to charity. They're not sort of if you're trying to pick the sort of, robber baron villain that you're going to say, this is the person, this is the, monopoly man personified who's trying to take money out of your wallet, they're a poor foil for you to pick as your villain, because they're not Donald Trump. They're not sort of willing to play the rich sort of dim mogul who says stupid stuff and is trying to throw their money around. They're very unassuming Midwestern people. I can appreciate that you might not appreciate their policies, but I just think they're hard to turn into a demon that the average voter is going to look at and say, that's somebody I want kicked out of my state.
Yeah, I think they do, though, serve as a metaphor for what's wrong with money in politics. And because they're two people with, they're brothers, it sort of paints this picture of people who have big money being able to influence elections, not just for Congress. In fact, I think they even put money, it may not have been them, but I know someone put money into the Columbus Zoo levy that was up this year and had an impact. So I think there's investments being done by some of these larger donors, even at local elections on levies. So I think that's important. But I think, again, people who get the point that big money is driving politics and making decisions not just at the governor's level and the House and the Senate, but now also in judicial elections. I think when it comes to the role that they may play, not just the Koch brothers, but anybody may play on judicial elections, I think you may have people who may resonate on the issue of the importance of getting big money out of politics, more so around judicial races than they might even for a congressional or a governor's race, which seems more natural place for big donors to invest.
So we've seen an increase in soft on crime attack ads in judicial races, and given the recent bipartisan efforts to change our criminal justice system, is there any evidence that soft on crime is as effective as it used to be? So are ads really as effective?
I can tell you, we did a race in Fresno County by district attorney with the new California system where everybody gets to vote in the primary. And we were working for the challenger. I mean, the main criticism of the incumbent was that she's not been, crime has gone up, that she's not been as tough on moving cases through the system, that they've had to release prisoners through mismanagement. And those were, this was a low turnout race with, highly energized voters, and those were fairly effective things. I mean, that's one race in one sort of very unique part of a unique state, but it certainly worked there that people think the job of the judicial system in large part is to, prosecute, manage, and mete out punishment to criminals. If you're failing at that, I think that's a pretty big mark against you for a lot of the electorate.
I have noticed that smart on crime is becoming more of a mantra in some places, and in some places it's more bipartisan, that some of these big expenses being put into the criminal justice system, even some Republicans are making some points and making some reforms happen. I know that's the case in Ohio with Governor Kasich and a few others where there's actually some work being done to reduce the level of prison and put some of that money more into treatment and more into resettling people. Rather than having an alternative to prison. And that the prison pipeline is driving a lot of the state budgets, and that's why I think it's more bipartisan. It may have less of a resonance now in terms of I think smart on crime has more resonance than maybe the weak on crime message.
I think it depends on, where you are.
Yeah.
If the crime rate is perceived to be going up, because some places it's not, but it's perceived to be, or if it's perceived to be going down. I mean, I think a lot of it depends on what's actually happening. I also think it depends on who you're trying to mobilize, since obviously tough on crime arguments are also, I think, a racial argument. So if you're trying to mobilize certain voters, it might be an argument that you use in that way. Again, that I think is totally context specific. But I do think there is, and this is based off just looking at legalizing marijuana, which is different than what you guys are doing, but I did the Washington campaign in 2012, and our strongest argument, and if you're there, you saw the ads, it was mostly about law enforcement resources, and it was actually most of our arguments around, the smart use of law enforcement resources, that you can go after violent crime and not deal with nonviolent crime if you reduce the number of arrests and prosecutions for, small possessions of small amount of marijuana. And it is interesting that, and those arguments are much stronger than, say, libertarian arguments about marijuana, or it's safer than alcohol, those kinds of arguments. And, saw the New York Times yesterday endorse legalizing marijuana. So I think that there is increasing awareness of the drain, especially in places like California, for example, where the prison system is such a drain financially on the state. I do think there's increasing awareness of kind of tough on crime actually has some perverse effects around the health of an economy. And it may be leading to, as you say, kind of a focus on smart, what did you call it, smart?
It's smart on crime.
Smart on crime. That may be, I don't know for sure, but that seems plausible to me.
Hearing the question again, I think there's at least, I don't know if the person was maybe referencing the, Rand Paul, and I think this will be a fascinating run. I do think Rand Paul's going to run with a lot of sort of new Republican ideas, and one of them is he's come out with a bipartisan bill on, reforming crime and dealing with people who serve their time better and, making things less felony. It'd be fascinating to see I know he's tested that a couple speeches. It'd be fascinating to see how that sort of plays as he's out in 2015, kind of trying to build his Republican support, with that as one of his issues.
Okay. So, Anna, you talked a little bit about drop-off voters during state elections. Can you elaborate on the ways to decrease the number of drop-off voters and educate these young people / minority?
Mm-hmm. So we actually know a lot about why people participate and don't participate in politics, and we actually know a lot about how to increase participation. And it really is an issue less of messaging and more of money, because we know that people who are asked to participate and asked repeatedly over time and reminded about participating actually are more likely to participate. And there's been a significant amount of research done mostly through the labor movement about the most effective ways to both get people to register to vote and get them to turn out. And it turns out, it's not that hard. It's just literally about money. So if you have the resources so for example, what we know is that if you send someone a piece of mail that says you need to, your vote is really important, it counts, and because you can make change, that is way less effective than sending a piece of mail that says enclosed is your voter registration document, and it looks like it comes from the state, right? Like literally just sending people a voter registration packet. And then if you actually do things like what we call kind of social pressure tactics, where you get people, say, to commit to vote, or you let people know that, their neighbors, vote, are you going to vote, which is all public information. I mean, it's kind of, you can go pretty far on these social pressure tactics to get people to participate. But the point is that there's a whole set of tactics that are very effective in increasing participation that have nothing to do with educating people about how important a particular election is or how important a particular issue is, but actually to make it easy and let them know when it is, and also apply some social pressure around reminding people around their kind of civic duty that this is a right, that it's a privilege, that it's something that people fought for, and that you should also exercise it. We saw a lot of this work in Virginia in the gubernatorial election, and one of the things that you actually saw, if you look at the makeup of the electorate in 2013 in Virginia, they did increase minority participation in that election. They changed the nature of that electorate. It's a big part of why McAuliffe won that race. So it's not rocket science, but it's very, very, very resource heavy. It's hard for campaigns to pull off. But it's something and you're going to see, I think, a lot of it in places like Georgia and Louisiana and North Carolina, where increasing minority turnout could be the difference between winning and losing those Senate seats.
Yeah, I think expanded use of voter guides are important. I know we've done one in a few states that I've worked in, and I know that League of Women Voters does it very well, but those are a lot of races that a lot of times don't get that marquee information out. So the more we can kind of put those races out there on the down ballot. There's plenty of TV ads for top of the ticket, but very few. You can't buy television from bottom of the ticket anymore, I don't think. So getting these things out in mailers and into the community that tells what these races are and the importance of them, I think is a good way to make sure we keep that emphasized.
So this is a pollster type question. Do professional pollsters ever ask questions to the public seeking to learn whether they evaluate judicial candidates with criteria any different from other candidates?
I don't think we have, but if a client wanted to, I'd be happy to. This is a business where you're serving the needs of your clients, and so I'm always, I think the things we've done have all been sort of viability studies on getting a merit-based selection for judges or something like that. But much of our work is sort of focused, goal-oriented. We want to try and get this initiative. We want this person to get elected. We want to, make a thoughtful pitch to legislators on our key issue. And so that usually doesn't lend itself well to these sort of, how many angels would fit on the head of a pin question of, do you do this different than that, or would you like somebody who stands sideways or smiles or something? That, I'm always happy to put that stuff in, but in the interest of sort of being efficient and cost-effective, we don't usually get to probe a lot on the intricacies of people's decision-making sometimes.
Yeah. So I worked in the retention election in Iowa in 2012, and I'm embarrassed, I'm blanking on the name of the judge. I didn't do it for him. It's the one left from the marriage equality decision. Right, exactly. So anyway, I did a couple surveys for, and including, it was for a coalition that included Justice at Stake, and it was really interesting, actually, the whole dynamics of that election. But one of the things we tested were a set of arguments, for and against him. And not surprisingly, arguments that spoke more to his qualifications, like his rating, were more powerful than, say, ideological arguments around his decision on marriage equality, which isn't surprising since people, they say, and I think there's probably some social desirability involved, but they say that they want to evaluate judges based on their qualifications and their ability to be impartial and ethical and less on what their positions are. Now, again, in reality, does that actually happen? It's probably more of that than they would say on a poll. So, again, we were testing the arguments that the right would make against him. We were not testing it because we were making arguments against him, but I was struck that the ones that spoke to whether or not he was an effective or qualified judge tested as higher negatives for him than his actual ideological positions, and that would be obviously different than someone running for office.
Can either of you talk about if there are differences between rank and file voters from political party leaders? Is that, or are they the same?
I think what you find is there's sort of a chain of progression of, the person who votes is a lot different in most cases than the person who will show up to volunteer. And that person's usually, the volunteer is usually less far down the line than somebody who will actually go to a convention. It's, I equate it, I'm a big sports fan, I equate it to sort of sports fandom that, there's people that'll sort of have some basic idea of who the two teams are. And that, they'll only watch the playoffs, they'll only watch during the finals. And then there's the diehard person who has, 3 fantasy teams or has, follows it every day. And it's sort of that. And so the political leader, a lot of times, I've always been struck in dealing with a lot of political leaders. A lot of their life is filled with, you think it's, boy, you're going to be making these grand plans, but a lot of it is often minutia of, how much do we need to allocate for this or that, or, do we have the bus rented for this or that? And so I think the big difference is a lot of rank and file people sort of, they intake the information, they participate diligently in the election, they make the best decision they can. But they're, the people much farther up, these people in leadership positions are often dealing with, not only the, let's make sure our candidates get elected, but, let's make sure we've got the right kind of, sandwiches for the donors or anything like this, where it's a lot of just any of the hassle of running a small business where you're dealing with kind of changing problems every day.
Yeah, but I think if you take it at a broader level, I mean, there's lots of evidence from academic research anyway that there's more ideological polarization at the top than there is in the electorate at large, and that's been growing over time. So if you measure the ADA scores of members of Congress, they've been going like this over time, while the vast majority of voters are still sort of in the middle. And it makes sense. I mean, anybody who's going to be active politically, either at the local level or obviously the national level, is going to be more ideological, because part of the reason you do it is you have a core set of beliefs that gives you the energy and motivation to be involved. Now, over time, there have been a lot of structural changes that have increased polarization, like the way redistricting happens in most states, for example, has increased polarization. So it's not just about the fact that people who are involved tend to be more ideological. There are structural causes as well, which in some ways makes it even harder to mitigate against that polarization.
Yeah, I think if you look at these town hall meetings over the recess, you'll start seeing that's a lot of the rank and file there showing up for those meetings. That's a lot of them coming with their signs, and some of them are yelling and some of them are bringing a lot of drama to those events, but that's some of the rank and file. And often you'll see, I guess, I saw Eric Cantor shouted down, for instance, at one of his town meetings, and it's sort of an example of here's a party leader and then here's the rank and file, and these are Republicans and they're in one room together, and it was a whole different kind of disconnect there going on. And that certainly happens a lot of times even on the Democratic side, when you have people who were doing the Occupy movement who were just maybe not even wanting the elected officials to come to speak to some of their events that were happening. So I think the rank and file represent a lot of forces. They do tend to be more partisan or ideologically partisan, and they do tend to be more impatient with the process of politics.
So I know we're coming close to the end, and I want to each ask of you, what other evolving political issues really could affect public opinion and the importance of the role of courts? What's your question?
I mean, I think, certainly what we've increasingly seen is legislators and governors and the federal government has sort of punted issues that normally they would resolve on their own to courts. And the courts are stuck making decisions, what constitutes a Senate recess, or, what constitutes the definition of marriage, or what is the manner and means in which you can spend money when you're participating in the political process. And I think that's going to increasingly lead to voters wanting to either, have courts they can really have faith in, because I know these people went through a thoughtful vetting process, or, turn courts into one more place where you can, get into your trenches and vote for your side. And I think that's, I think absent seeing kind of a change in how court and how legislators and Congress are going to work, that, we may increasingly have to see courts making calls on issues that, previously have been the domain of legislators and governors and executives making, getting together and finding middle ground and getting something passed.
I would agree with that, and I think that that's at least in part why people's attitudes about the Supreme Court have changed so significantly in seeing it as a kind of, probably started with Bush v. Gore, but as a kind of very political and partisan institution, all those 5-4 decisions, and you may see that trickle down to the state level.
Well, I just want to make this point, and that is the Democracy Initiative has been working a lot on the Senate rules reform, and even though it's not a state court issue, it's showing how the judicial system can be locked up because of the dysfunction. And I think people who are voting may view dysfunction of the political system as an issue. They just don't, it's not attached to one particular issue, but it's attached to inability to get immigration reform marriage equality or the Voting Rights Act, or even major jobs bill, the increase in the minimum wage. These are the issues that are being blocked by dysfunction in Congress or either at the state level. So I believe that those kind of issues, the ability of government to function, may be one of the issues too that may be a sleeper issue out there.
Sorry, I have a lot of questions left. Actually, you know what? One issue that we haven't brought up, and it impacts elections, and there's been an increase in discussion about this, is redistricting. They all make faces. So you're, I know we don't have that much time, but so redistricting is such a big piece of the electoral system. And your thoughts on, you know, how redistricting is going to be playing to affect in some of these races?
Well, I personally think the best thing you could do to change the way our system works is to have nonpartisan redistricting. And if you look at states like Arizona and Iowa and California where they have it, you can see that there are more competitive seats, the congressional delegations are more evenly divided, and you do have people who are elected who are more moderate. I think that could be the single most important thing one could do to change. Now, obviously, it's incredibly difficult to do. You know, obviously, we're not going to know for a while what happens state by state. A lot of it depends on who's controlling the state houses and legislatures in different places, like Pennsylvania, for example, Texas, places that have been really, really gerrymandered, so that there's very little party competition. And we won't know a lot about that, obviously, until we get to 2020 and know who's controlling those legislatures. But if there's, again, I think that one of the things you could do, if we did one thing and had nonpartisan redistricting across this country, it would fundamentally change Congress and probably allow the government to function again. I may be overstating it. I don't know. It's part of it anyway.
I think if we can link some of the nonpartisan judicial races, of the nonpartisan selection of and merit selection of judges with the nonpartisan selection of these commissions that are in some states, I think California and a few other states is working to try and help do a better job of redistricting, we might go further. But really, an accurate census count, it all starts with an accurate census count. It starts with making sure all of our folks are counted and making sure people are aware that we believe that people should choose their representatives and representatives should not choose their people. I mean, the more we keep saying that, I think people get the message and the need for reform may come up, but I think you're right, it all depends on what happens in 2018 and who's going to really be sitting in the governor's seats and some of those statewide offices when it comes time to start drawing the line. So 2014 may be even more important than 2018 may be more important than 2014, actually.
So I'd like to close with, if each of you can have some closing comments on like what the big takeaway is leaving for this election as we head into it. I'll give you 2 minutes to think about it. But again, this is just the beginning of discussion. I think what will happen over the next couple of days is that as you think about where we are in the political landscape, you know, how you're starting to frame your campaigns, what's doable and winnable in your states, and how you actually approach your campaigns. So this was not meant for us to dive into like specifically the courts, but really how everything at the top is going to impact at the local level. So who would like to go first on your top takeaways in the political for people to leave with?
I'll lead off. I mean, I think I would say one thing I'd emphasize with all of you is, you know, Anna mentioned all these studies, and one of the biggest ones they found is getting somebody to turn out is if you have a peer who comes and says, hey, I'm going to vote, make sure you do too, and here's an issue that really matters to me, and get them engaged that way. You know, that's something that you need a lot of volunteers to pull off if you're going to do this, you know, as a ongoing part of your process. But it's a relatively low-cost thing, and it does make a big difference that, you know, the 2014 is going to be an election. It's going to be a lot about turnout. Who shows up, and what difference do they make? And, you know, politicians are responsive to the voters who show up and hold them accountable. And to the extent you can go back and marshal your resources and have, you know, your volunteers and your supporters and your people who are on your outside, you know, reach out to their, you know, friends, colleagues, neighbors, and get them to participate in this process. That'll make a big difference in, you know, whether or not those people turn out and what they think about your issues.
I think that since 2010 and 11, since the 2010 election, there's been a wave of state legislation to make it harder to vote, particularly around early voting, particularly around making it harder to count provisional ballots, in some cases rolling back some of the laws that were won, like in North Carolina around Election Day registration, and in Ohio certainly we had Golden Week for several years, and now that's gone. These kinds of things have made it more likely that the turnout won't be the same as even 2010, when some of those laws were, in fact, on the books. The second is that the outcome, election has consequences, everybody knows that, but I think knowing the stakes and where they are, knowing that we are in a situation where we may very well have a president that's not popular enough to mobilize some of the Democratic base, I think you will see an election where I believe people are, if you call it a status quo election, you might have people basically making decisions on turning out on their own situation in their community or in their personal lives, and it could really create an unpredictable result. So I think because some of these local elections will be localized, what goes on in every single local community will make a difference. And again, getting rid of the barriers to voting and just being aware that those barriers do exist now where they didn't exist in some states could really make a difference. So we should be on the lookout for those and make sure we see how they impact the turnout.
I guess what I think will be interesting and important for the future about this election is the role that money plays, and I don't mean in the sense of super PAC spending money, but I mean as an issue. I mean, really, if you look at the McCain-Feingold legislation, that if you look at 2004, that legislation had the ironic impact of just increasing the amount of outside money, just moving the money around and creating, and you saw the rise of 527s and C4s, and it's now, at a very different place than it was in 2004, but that was the first election where we saw sort of big outside money. But it's been difficult, and I've worked for advocates in this space to try to talk about campaign finance reform, and I think this is going to be the first election where we see significant national money spent with a message around money in politics and the impact it has for people's lives. And I think, depending on what happens, I mean, obviously, if those messages fail, it might mean that we don't have that conversation again. But if there's actually some traction, people believe on an instinctive level that politics is corrupt, that politicians are kind of owned by big money interests, and that's part of the reason why we have dysfunction and people doing well at the top and the rest of people not doing so well. And if we're able, at least on the Democratic side, to win some races around that, I actually think we'll start having a much more robust conversation about money in politics.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. I know there are a lot more questions, and hopefully before they leave, you may be able to corner them if your question was not answered. So a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.